Seat 34B. She didn't look up. While his voice filled the cabin, her husband announced his engagement to a flight attendant. His sister filmed it, laughing as passengers turned in their seats. 10 years ago, she sold her wedding ring to keep him alive. Now she quietly owned every seat on this plane, and not one of them knew it yet. Before we begin, if you've ever been made small by the very people you carried, this story is for you. Stay till the end, because the quiet ones, they always have the last word. Watch closely. Let me tell you about a woman named Zuri. She was sitting in the back of a plane in a seat that was too small for the life she had lived. 30,000 feet in the air. A window on her right, a stranger on her left, and a whole cabin of people who had no idea who she was. She had her hands folded in her lap, still, calm, the kind of still that most people never learn because most people have never had to. You wouldn't have looked twice at her. That was the point. She had booked that seat herself, coach, the back of the plane. She could have flown up front, of course. She could have flown in a seat with her own name stitched into the leather if she wanted, but she didn't want. She wanted to watch one last time the man she married when he thought nobody who mattered was looking. Some truths you have to sit in the back of the plane to learn. She wore a plain gray sweater, no jewelry, her hair pulled back soft. A woman you'd pass in an airport and forget. And up in the front of that plane, past the curtain, in the wide leather seats where the drinks come in real glasses, sat the man who had spent 10 years teaching himself to forget her. His name was Kofi, her husband. Watch closely now, because this is where it begins. The seatbelt light was still on when Kofi stood up. He was a handsome man, and he knew it. Broad shoulders, a smile he used like a tool. He walked up the aisle toward the front galley, and he leaned in and said something to one of the flight attendants, and she laughed and handed him something. She handed him the intercom. Now, you and I both know a passenger has no business holding that intercom, but Kofi had a way of making people bend the rules for him. He always had. He picked it up like a man who had been waiting his whole life for a microphone, and his voice filled the cabin. "Good afternoon, everybody," he said, warm as syrup. "Sorry to interrupt your flight, but I've got something to say and I couldn't wait one more minute to say it." Heads turned. People smiled the way strangers smile when they think something sweet is about to happen. A proposal, maybe. People love a proposal on a plane. Zuri did not turn. She kept her eyes on the seat back in front of her, but her hands folded in her lap. One thumb moved slowly across the other, back and forth, back and forth. For a long time, I was married to a woman who made me feel small, quiet, cold. Y'all know the type. A few nervous chuckles. But then, God sent me somebody who makes me feel like a king. And today, at this altitude, in front of all you good people as my witnesses. He turned toward the galley, toward a young woman in a Skylark Airways uniform, her lips painted, her smile ready. "I'm asking Brielle to be my wife." The cabin made that sound a cabin makes, that soft rush of air, that "aww." Somebody clapped. Brielle put both hands over her heart and did a little spin in the aisle like she'd won something. And back in 34B, Zuri closed her eyes. Do you understand what just happened? Let me make it plain. That man was still married. The ring was still on the woman in the back. He didn't divorce her and move on. He announced his next wife over the speakers with his current wife 20 rows behind him, so that the whole sky could hear it. But he wasn't done. Betrayal like this never travels alone. Because now a second voice cut through the cabin, sharp, delighted, cruel. woman came walking backwards down the aisle, holding up her phone, filming. It was Renee, Kofi's sister. "Say something for the camera, sis," Renee called out, aiming the phone right at Zuri's face. "Come on, don't be shy now. You always so quiet. Smile, you going viral today." Passengers shifted. Some of them finally understood. You could see it move across their faces, the smiles falling, the confusion, the uncomfort. The woman in the back wasn't a stranger to this. The woman in the back was the wife.
And then came the third blade, the one that cut deepest because it came from blood. From the front, an older woman's voice, loud enough to carry, sweet enough to sting. Kofi's mother, Loretta. She didn't even turn all the way around. She just said it to the air, to the cabin, to anyone listening. "Some women you upgrade, baby, and some women you leave in coach." The cabin laughed. Not everybody, but enough. Enough that Zuri heard it wrap around her like cold water. The man beside her, a stranger, a big man in a work shirt who'd been asleep since takeoff, woke up somewhere in the middle of all this. He looked at the phone in her face and the papers on her tray and the laughing family up front, and then he looked at Zuri, and quietly, so only she could hear, he said, "You all right, ma'am?" She didn't answer. She just gave him the smallest nod. But something in her chest moved at that. A stranger, the only person on that whole plane who thought to ask if she was okay. Remember him. Kindness always matters in these stories. It just doesn't always arrive when you expect it. Husband, sister, mother, and the outsider standing in the aisle in her airline uniform, glowing. 4 people, 1 woman, and 30,000 feet of nowhere to run. Now, here's the question I want you to sit with. Why didn't she move? Why didn't she stand up, scream, throw something, cry? Any of us would have, wouldn't you? She didn't. Instead, Kofi did something worse than words. He walked back down the aisle, all the way to 34B, and he dropped a folder on her tray table. Divorce papers. Right there, in front of the man beside her, in front of the whole watching cabin. "Sign these before we land," Kofi said. Quiet now, just for her, but not quiet enough. "Do it clean, Zuri. Do it quiet. For once in your life, don't make a scene." And Zuri finally lifted her eyes, slow. She looked at the papers. She looked at the man she had married when he had holes in his shoes. One of her hands rose, not to the papers, to her collar. Her fingers found something underneath the gray sweater, something small and hidden, and they pressed it, just for a second, like it was giving her strength. "Okay," she whispered. That was all. 1 word. Kofi smiled like he'd won. He turned and walked back to first class, to his new fiancée, to his mother, to his sister's little glowing phone. But watch closely, because a young flight attendant, one who had been near the back the whole time, had seen Zuri's face, had seen that hand go to the collar, and that young woman went pale, pale like she'd seen a ghost, pale like something had just fallen into place in her mind, and she turned and hurried up the aisle toward the cockpit, walking fast, then faster. Why? What did she see? Hold on to that question. We'll come back to it. Her daddy used to tell her something back when she was a little girl with grease under her fingernails. He used to say, real wings don't make noise, they just lift. So she stayed quiet. She always stayed quiet. They thought her silence was surrender. It wasn't. But to understand why that woman didn't flinch, why she could sit there and take all of it without breaking, we have to go back, all the way back, to a hangar, a poor man's dream, and a little silver pin. Before Zuri was Mrs. Bell, she was Zuri Carter, and the Carters didn't have much. Picture a small town, the kind of place the highway forgot, and at the edge of it, a little airfield with cracked pavement and a hangar with a leaking roof. That's where her father worked. That's where her father lived, if we're being honest. A man named Otis Carter.
an aircraft mechanic. Otis had hands like old leather and a back that ached every winter, and he could listen to an engine turn over and tell you what was wrong with it the way a doctor listens to a heart. He wasn't rich. He would never be rich, but that man loved the sky like it was a person. And every day after school, little Zuri would come to that hangar and sit on an overturned bucket and watch her father work. He'd hand her a wrench, he'd point up at the planes crossing the clouds, and he'd tell her his dream. "One day, baby girl," Otis would say, wiping his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth, "I'm gonna build something, not just fix other men's planes, build my own, a whole company, wings that carry folks like us, folks nobody ever gave a window seat to." And little Zuri believed him, because when your daddy dreams out loud, you believe him. That's just how it works.
She learned everything in that hangar. How an engine breathes, how a wing holds a whole heavy machine up on nothing but moving air, how a man can have empty pockets and a full heart at the same time. She learned to read a blueprint before she could read a chapter book, and she learned the thing her father cared about most, that you build a good thing quietly, honestly, one bolt at a time, and you let the work speak for itself. "Anybody can be loud, baby girl," Otis would say. "Takes a strong person to be quiet and still get it done." She didn't understand that yet. She would. Oh, she would. One evening, she must have been 9, Otis crouched down in front of her in that hangar, and he took something out of his shirt pocket, a little silver pin shaped like a pair of wings, old, worn soft at the edges from years of his thumb rubbing it. "These were given to me a long time ago," he said, "by a man who believed in me before anybody else did. Now, I'm giving them to you." And he pinned those little wings right on her collar, right over her heart. "One day you're gonna fly higher than they'll ever let a Carter fly. You hear me? Keep these close. And remember, real wings don't make noise. They just lift." She kept them close. She kept them close for the rest of her life. But dreams are fragile things in a poor man's hands, because there was a bigger airline in that region, a company with money and lawyers and men in good suits, and Otis's little field sat on land they wanted. They squeezed him. They spread word he was sloppy, unsafe, finished. It wasn't true, but a lie in a nice suit beats the truth in coveralls every time. They took his field, they took his name and dragged it through the mud until the whole town said the same thing. The Carters are done. That old man had big dreams and nothing to show for them. Otis died a few winters later. Heart just gave out, and they buried him believing his dream had died with him. Now hold that thought, because that lie, the Carter dream is dead, is a loop I need you to remember. We're going to come back and pull that thread, and when we do, it's going to unravel 3 lives. But first, a young man. Zuri met Kofi when they were both young and both broke. He came from the same kind of nothing she did, and back then, oh, he was sweet. Back then, he'd walk 2 miles in the rain to bring her a plate of food. Back then, he'd hold her hand and tell her they were going to make it out together. She loved him when he had nothing. Understand that. That's the part that matters. She didn't marry a rich man and get bored. She married a poor man and believed in him the exact same way she'd believed in her father. And when Kofi wanted to start a little business and it started to sink and the bank turned cold, Zuri did the thing you already heard about. She slid her wedding ring off her finger and she sold it, and she poured everything she had left into keeping his dream breathing. Because that's what love does, she thought. Love invests. Love bleeds a little so the other person can stand. She thought he would remember that forever. She was a soft woman. That was never her weakness. It only looked like one. And now look at her. The little girl who was promised the whole sky, folded up small in seat 34B, with a folder of divorce papers on her tray, and her father's silver wings hidden under a gray sweater. How does a life go from that hangar to this humiliation? How does the girl who was promised everything end up in the back of the plane? Patience. She kept her father's promise like a secret.
And a secret is only powerful right up until the moment it isn't. But first, the betrayal had one more turn left to take. Let me tell you how a good man goes bad. Because Kofi wasn't born a villain. Nobody is. And if I paint him as some cartoon, you won't feel the knife the way you're supposed to. Kofi had a wound, and the wound was old, and it had a voice. The voice was his mother. Loretta never thought Zuri was good enough, not because Zuri did anything wrong, but because Zuri was quiet, and Loretta mistook weak for strong. And Loretta wanted a daughter-in-law who would make the family look like something. For years, at every dinner, she'd lean into Kofi's ear. "You settled, baby," she'd whisper. "A man like you could have had a woman who lights up a room. Instead, you got one who won't even lift her head." And year after year, that whisper did its work. Because here's the truth about Kofi, the human truth. He never felt like a man next to Zuri. She handled everything, quietly. The bills, the trouble, the hard calls, she'd just handle it. And instead of feeling grateful, he felt small. He felt like a boy being taken care of. And a certain kind of man would rather burn the house down than feel small inside it. That's where Brielle came in. Brielle was young and bright and loud in all the ways Zuri was soft and still. And when Brielle looked at Kofi, she made him feel 10 feet tall. She laughed at everything he said. She called him big man. She made him feel like the king his mother always told him he was supposed to be. But understand Brielle too. Don't just hate her. Brielle grew up hungry, the real kind of hungry, the kind that leaves a mark. And she swore, the way hungry children swear, that she would never be poor again, not ever. So when a handsome, confident man told her he had a whole new life coming, a door about to open, a way up and out, she grabbed on with both hands. She thought Kofi was her ladder out. She didn't know the truth. She didn't know the life he bragged about wasn't his to give, and she surely didn't know who the quiet woman in the back really was. Fear, wearing the costume of ambition. That was Brielle. And I want you to hold a little pity for her even now, because a person who has been hungry will do desperate things to never be hungry again, and desperation makes people blind. She wasn't evil. She was just looking at the wrong man and calling him a rescue. And Renee and Loretta? They poured gasoline. They wanted the family to climb, and Zuri in their eyes was an anchor. So they told Kofi stories. That Zuri was hiding money from him, that she was cold, plotting, holding him back, that he deserved better, and better was standing right there in a flight attendant's uniform. Oh, the irony. They said she was hiding money, if only they knew how right they were and how wrong. Now, on that same plane, in those wide leather seats, Kofi was leaning close to Brielle, laughing, running his mouth, the way men do when they think they've already won. "Soon as she signs those papers," he said, "I'm done. Done carrying dead weight. You know how long I've been holding that woman up? A decade, a whole decade of my life." And here is where I have to tell you the thing they didn't know, the thing that makes this whole story turn. That airline they were flying on, Skylark, was part of something bigger, a company that ran routes across half the country, a company that employed 40,000 people, pilots, mechanics, the very flight attendants pouring their drinks. Every single one of those 40,000 paychecks was signed under one name at the top, one owner. Worth more than every dream Kofi had ever bragged about at every dinner table stacked together and multiplied. And Kofi had been living inside that fortune for years without ever once knowing whose it was. He never asked how the bills got paid. He never asked how a quiet woman kept them afloat through every hard season. He just took and complained that it wasn't enough, and never learned the name at the top of the paper. But she knew. Oh, she knew. And back in 34B, something was happening to Zuri that I need you to see. She got up, quiet as always, and she walked to the little lavatory at the back of the plane, and she slid the door shut, and she looked at herself in that small mirror under that ugly light. And the woman who never broke, broke. Not loud, never loud, but the tears came, hot and fast, 10 years of them. Her shoulders shook. She gripped the edge of that little sink, and one hand went to her collar, and she pulled out the silver wings and held them so hard the edges bit her palm. You want to know what breaks a strong woman? It isn't the cruelty. She'd survived cruelty her whole life. It's the memory of love. It's remembering the boy who walked through the rain with a plate of food and looking at the man who just dropped divorce papers on her tray table for sport. It's the distance between those two men. That's what breaks you. She thought about all of it right there in that little room with the door locked. The wedding, his mother refusing to smile in single photo, the nights she stayed up doing the hard math so he could sleep easy.
The way he'd started coming home late, then colder, then cruel. She had watched love leave the house one small piece at a time, and she had told herself she was imagining it because the alternative hurt too much to hold. And now here it was, out loud, over a loudspeaker, in front of the sky. No more imagining. She pressed her hand flat against her mouth so the sound wouldn't carry, and she let it all go, silent, the way she'd learned to do everything. She whispered to the mirror. "You were never carrying me, Kofi," she said, so soft. Not once, not one single day. And then a knock. Gentle, that same young flight attendant, the one who'd gone pale, the one who'd rushed to the cockpit. "Ma'am," the young woman said through the door, her voice trembling with something like awe. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry to disturb you. The captain would like to confirm your instructions." Zuri went very still. She looked up at her own eyes in that mirror. She wiped her face, and slowly, for the first time in that whole flight, she smiled. "Real wings don't make noise," she heard her father say, from somewhere far away and somewhere very close. "They just lift." He thought he was flying toward a brand new life. He had no idea he was flying inside of hers. But what happened next, not one soul on that plane saw it coming. Here's what you have to understand about power, real power. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Kofi had spent the whole flight with a microphone in his hand. He thought that was power, holding the speaker, making the cabin listen. But watch what real power looks like. Watch how quiet it is when it finally moves. The seatbelt sign chimed. The captain's voice came over the very same intercom Kofi had abused an hour before. But this time, the captain wasn't reading altitude and weather. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, and there was something different in his voice, something careful, something proud. "On behalf of the entire crew of Skylark Airways, it is the honor of my career to welcome aboard, traveling with us today, the founder and chairwoman of Carter Sky Holdings. The woman's name is on the door of every hangar we fly out of, Miss Zuri Carter." Silence. But not the silence you're expecting, not the whole cabin gasping at once. No. Watch how it really happened, because it started with the crew. The young flight attendant at the back straightened her spine and turned towards seat 34B and stood at attention. Then the one by the galley set down her tray and did the same. Then another, and another. One by one, up and down that aisle, every uniform on that plane turned toward the quiet woman in the gray sweater and stood still. Heads slightly bowed, the way you stand for someone who signs your name into a life. The silence spread outward from them, from the crew to the front rows, to first class, to Kofi. And Kofi's face, Lord, I wish you could have seen it, the smile draining out of it drop by drop. "Carter?" he said, his voice cracked on it. No, that's her maiden name. That's a coincidence. That's
Do you remember the questions I asked you to hold? Two of them just came due. Who was I. Carter, the name at the top of 40,000 paychecks, the name nobody had ever connected to quiet Mrs. Bell? It was her. It had always been her. She hadn't married money. She hadn't inherited it. She had built it, quietly, patiently, over 10 long years, under her maiden name, in the dark, while a whole family stepped over her and called her dead weight. And what happened to her father's dream, the one they buried believing was dead? She dug it up. She took the mud they'd thrown on the Carter name and she carried it into the sky. She named the company after him, Carter Sky Holdings. The dream in that leaking hangar hadn't died with Otis. It had just been waiting for her little girl to be ready. Now watch her stand. She didn't rush. She never rushed. She rose from seat 34B slow and easy, and she reached up to her collar, and she unpinned the little silver wings and moved them where everyone could see them, right over her heart, catching the light. And then Zuri Carter walked up the aisle, past the rows of standing crew, past the staring passengers, through the curtain, into first class, into the wide leather seats where her husband sat frozen and her mother-in-law's mouth hung open, and Brielle's ready smile had finally died. The whole cabin was watching now, the people who laughed, the people who turned in their seats to point their phones. Renee's phone was still up, but her hand was shaking, and the little red recording light trembled because she was starting to understand what she had captured, and it was not what she had planned.
You see the shape of it now, don't you? Every weapon they used, they had handed to her. The microphone Kofi grabbed to shame her became the microphone the captain used to crown her. The phone Renee raised to make her a joke made her a legend instead. The uniform Brielle wore to feel superior turned out to belong to the woman she was smirking at. That is what pride does in the end. It builds the exact rope it hangs itself with. Watch closely, because that lesson is the whole story. Loretta, the mother who whispered "you settled" into her son's ear for 10 years, got to sit in her quiet house and watch her favorite boy come home with nothing. No wife, no fiancé, no fortune. Just the echo of every cruel thing she taught him to believe. She had spent a decade telling him he was too good for Zuri. Now she got to spend the rest of her life knowing Zuri had been holding the whole family up the entire time, and that her whispers had thrown it all away. And Kofi stood in that arrivals hall as it all came down. He called after her. Of course he did. Zuri, wait, we can fix this. 10 years, baby, that's gotta count for something. We can... Zuri stopped. She turned. And here is the part I want you to remember, because this is the part that separates a woman with a power from a person with a heart. She didn't scream at him. She didn't laugh. She reached into her bag and she took out a single plain envelope and she held it out to him. Inside was a settlement, fair, and honestly more than he had any right to. Enough for a man to land softly and start again if he was smart. She didn't have to give him a thing. She gave it anyway. Because that's who she was. Cruelty was never going to be how this ended. Not for her. She said quietly, "You had 10 years to say my name right. 10 years to learn who I was. Take this. Go build something honest, Kofi. It's the only kind that lasts." And then she slid her wedding ring off her finger, the plain band that had replaced the one she sold, and she set it in his open palm, on top of the envelope. And then she turned, and she walked into the light of that terminal. Alone, her head high, her father's wings shining over her heart. The world had finally seen her. But peace, real peace, was never about being seen.
Let me take you back to the hangar. The last time. It had a new roof now. The cracked pavement was smooth and black. The leaking old building where a poor man once dreamed out loud was the beating heart of Carter Sky Holdings. And planes rolled in and out of it all day. Planes that carried folks who'd never been given a window seat, exactly like Otis said. And Zuri stood in the middle of it, in the same spot where she used to sit on an overturned bucket and hand her father his wrenches. She wasn't bitter. You'd think she would be after all of that. But bitterness is a heavy thing to fly with, and she had let it go somewhere back over those clouds. She had forgiven Kofi. Not for his sake, for hers. She had kept her softness. That soft heart they all mistook for weakness. She still had it, unbroken, and it was the strongest thing about her. There was a girl in the hangar that day. Young, maybe 12. Grease under her nails, watching the mechanics with hungry eyes, a kid from the same kind of nothing Zuri came from. Zuri had seen her hanging around for weeks, seen the way she looked up at the planes. Zuri walked over, and she reached up to her own collar and she unpinned the little silver wings, the ones her father gave her, the ones that had ridden hidden under a gray sweater through the worst day of her life. And she knelt down in front of that girl, the same way Otis once knelt in front of her. These were given to me by my daddy, by a man who believed in me before anybody else did. Now I'm giving them to you. And she pinned the wings on the girl's collar, right over her heart. One day, you're gonna fly higher than they'll ever let a girl like you fly. You keep these close, and you remember something from me. Zuri looked down at Kofi, and she was calm. That was the most devastating part. She was so calm. Get up, she said, not loud. She never said anything loud. Not out of your seat, just up. Look at me. And Kofi, the man who held the microphone, the man who'd never once looked back at seat 34B, finally lifted his eyes to his wife's face. There it is, she said softly. 10 years, and that's the first time you've really looked at me. Isn't that something? She reached into the seat pocket in front of him and pulled out the folder, the divorce papers, his papers. She set them gently on his tray table. His now. You wanted me to sign these quietly, she said. You know, I signed something quietly once before. She let that sit. 10 years ago, a little note that kept your business alive when the bank wouldn't. I signed it with everything I had, and I sold the one thing on my hand that said you loved me, and I never told a single soul. Because that's what love does. It signs quiet. It gives quiet. She tapped the folder once. So you keep these papers, Kofi. I'll be glad to sign. But the plane you're sitting in, the seat, the salary, the whole big future you were up here bragging about, baby, those were always mine. Nobody breathed. Loretta, the woman who said some women you leave in coach, found her voice, small and shaking. Zuri, sweetheart, now you know we always... Miss Loretta, Zuri didn't even raise her voice. You were right about one thing. Some women you upgrade, and some women were the whole airline the entire time. And Brielle, poor, hungry, frightened Brielle, looked at Kofi, then at the woman who owned the uniform on her own body, and you could see the ladder she'd climbed turn to smoke beneath her feet. She took one step back from Kofi, then another, physically moving away from him like his sinking might pull her down too. Kofi stared up at his wife, the king with no kingdom, the man who held the microphone and never once knew whose plane he was shouting in. Zuri, he whispered, baby, I didn't. Real wings don't make noise, Kofi, she said. And now she said it out loud, all the way, the words her father gave her in a leaking hangar 30 years before. They just lift. You'd have known that if you had ever, one single time, listened. The plane hadn't even landed, but 3 lives already had, hard. Now, some of you came here for this next part. I understand. Go on and let yourself feel it. But watch how she does it, because the way a person wins tells you everything about who they are. The plane landed, and when a plane lands carrying the woman who owns it, the world rearranges itself very fast. Kofi's whole engagement, that grand announcement over the speakers, had been built on money that was never his. He'd been bragging about a future that belonged down to the last bolt to the wife he was throwing away. And the moment that truth walked out into the daylight of the arrivals hall, everything he thought he had evaporated. The lifestyle was hers, the status was hers. The version of himself he sold to Brielle, the big man, the man going places, that man had never existed. He was just a boy in borrowed shoes, standing in an airport with a folder of divorce papers and a family staring at him like strangers. Brielle didn't even wait for the luggage. "So all of this," she said, gesturing at the terminal, at the planes out the window, at the whole world he'd promised her, "was hers? The whole time? You had me thinking you were somebody." She shook her head, and there was fear in it, that old hungry fear. "I wanted a man who was going somewhere. You were standing on top of her the entire time." And she walked, out of his life, fast on her sharp heels, chasing the next ladder. And not long after, Brielle found herself quietly reassigned to the smallest routes the company had, far from the front of any plane. Because you do not disrespect the founder on her own aircraft and keep your wings. That's not cruelty. That's just gravity. And Renee? Renee's little video, the one where she laughed and told her sister-in-law to smile for the internet. Oh, that video did go viral, just not the way she planned. Because the internet learned very quickly who the quiet woman in the gray sweater actually was, and the whole world watched Renee mock the founder of an airline, watched her point a phone in the face of the one woman who owned the very sky they were all flying through. The laughter turned around and pointed back at her. Renee took that video down. It was too late. The internet never forgets, and it does not forgive a bully. The girl looked up. "What?" Zuri smiled. "Real wings don't make noise," she said. "They just lift." And somewhere, a plane climbed up off that runway and into the wide blue sky, silent from where they stood on the ground, just lifting, carrying people higher than anybody ever said they were allowed to go. So here's the thing I want to leave with you, and I want you to really hear it. They will underestimate a quiet woman every single time. They'll mistake her softness for weakness. They'll take her kindness and call it foolishness. They'll put her in the back of the plane and never once ask whose plane it is. Let them. Because dignity doesn't announce itself over a speaker. It doesn't need a microphone. It just lifts. Real wings never made noise. If Zuri's story moved something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video for every quiet soul who was ever counted out. Comment, "Real wings," if you believe dignity always wins in the end. And subscribe, because next time, the person they underestimated might just be you. Fly high. We'll see you in the next story.